Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wandered too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating, but I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere, no path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. Okay, I muttered, you've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. Hey, I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. You lost too? The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. I've been walking for days, he said, his voice hoarse. The trail, it keeps changing. Are you okay? I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. No one's okay out here. I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave. I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. Look, I said, pulling out my GPS. We can find our way back. The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. It won't help. The forest is messing with it. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us the forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me, but deep down I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. Before we begin the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. When we first arrived at Shenandoah National Park, I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. The towering trees, the vast open skies, and the faint sound of birds singing in the distance. This was exactly the kind of break we all needed. I'm Alex, the planner of the group, and I had organized this camping trip to get away from the stress of city life. Mark, my boyfriend, sat in the passenger seat beside me, relaxed and smiling as we made our way along the winding mountain road. Behind us in the RV were Jessica and Eric, my two closest friends. They weren't exactly the outdoorsy type, but they had agreed to come along, maybe out of some sense of duty to reconnect. Eric was already cracking jokes about how bad he'd be at camping, while Jessica half laughed nervously, fiddling with her phone. I remember feeling so confident, so prepared. I had planned everything, except, of course, for the things no one could plan for. We parked the RV at a small, secluded site off the Appalachian Trail, far from the more populated areas. That was the whole point. Isolation, serenity, nature at its purest. The weather was supposed to be clear all weekend, perfect for hiking and camping. As we started setting up camp, the first signs of trouble were small. Jessica complained about her shoes. "These hiking boots are killing me. Why did I even buy them?" she groaned. "They're probably just stiff," I said, brushing her off. I was already focused on getting the tent up, but that's when I noticed Mark shaking his head. "The tent's missing poles," he said, laughing a little. "We'll have to use the RV for tonight." "Fine," I replied, hiding my frustration. "Minor setbacks. Nothing more." The real trouble began as dusk fell. It was subtle at first. As we sat around the small campfire Mark had built, the woods around us seemed to grow quieter. The birdsong, once a pleasant background, faded into nothing. No wind stirred the leaves, and even the occasional sound of wildlife disappeared. I chalked it up to the natural rhythms of the forest, nocturnal creatures and all that. But then I noticed the smell. At first, it was faint, a whiff of something rotten, like spoiled meat. I thought maybe it was something in the air or that something had died nearby. I didn't mention it, not wanting to freak anyone out. Eric, of course, was oblivious to the shift in mood. He was still joking around, telling some story about a horror movie he'd seen last week. "This place reminds me of one of those settings," he said, grinning as he poked at the fire. "A group of friends in the middle of nowhere, and then bam! Haunted by some spirit or creature." "Shut up," Jessica muttered, hugging her knees. "This place is creepy enough already." I rolled my eyes at them both, but Mark shifted uneasily beside me, glancing out into the darkening woods. I was about to ask him what was wrong when he stood up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said, feeling a flicker of irritation. We'd barely been here a few hours and they were already on edge. "I swear I heard something," he said, his voice tense like footsteps, heavy, coming from the woods. Eric laughed, but it was strained. "It's probably a bear or something. Or maybe Bigfoot." Jessica looked pale, her eyes darting to the dark forest around us. "This isn't funny, guys." "It's nothing," I said firmly. "Just the woods settling down for the night. Let's not spook ourselves over nothing." But as the evening wore on, that smell of rot kept coming back, and so did the uneasy silence. Even the crackle of the fire felt muted. The next day was supposed to be better. We set out on the trail, hoping to shake off the weirdness of the night before. The weather was colder than expected, with a thick mist hanging low in the valley, making everything damp. Jessica slipped a few times on the muddy path, cursing under her breath. "This fog is so creepy," she muttered. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "It'll clear up once the sun's out. Let's just enjoy the hike." But I could tell he was uneasy too. None of us had slept well. Every time I drifted off, I thought I heard something moving outside the RV. Maybe it was my imagination, but something kept waking me up, like a low rustling or breathing. Halfway through the hike, we reached a lookout point. The fog had lifted just enough for us to see the rolling hills stretching out below us. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. Then I saw Mark standing at the edge of the trees, staring into the distance. "Mark?" I called. He didn't answer. I walked over to him, a knot forming in my stomach. "What's wrong?" He pointed, his face pale. "Do you see that?" I squinted, looking where he was pointing. At first, I saw nothing but trees. But then something moved, a figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible through the mist. It stood completely still, as though it had been there the entire time, watching. "It's just a hiker," I said, though my voice sounded less confident than I'd hoped. "That's no hiker," Mark whispered. "Look at it." The figure stood too tall, its limbs too thin, and its skin seemed pale, almost translucent. But before I could get a better look, it was gone, melted into the fog. By the time we got back to the RV, the mood had soured. Mark was withdrawn, barely speaking, and Jessica kept glancing over her shoulder as though she expected something to jump out at us. The smell returned as we gathered around the campfire again that night. This time it was stronger, more pungent, like decaying meat left out in the sun. Eric wrinkled his nose. "Okay, seriously, what is that?" "It's the woods," I said, though even I didn't believe it anymore. The silence pressed down on us like a weight, and then from deep in the trees we heard it, a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. "Help me." We all froze. "What the hell?" Eric whispered, his eyes wide. The voice came again, a little closer. "Help! Help me!" "It's someone in trouble," Mark said, standing up. "We need to go check." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We don't. That doesn't sound right." The voice was too calm, too controlled. There was no panic in it, no urgency. It sounded wrong, like it was echoing in the wrong direction. Jessica was shaking now, her face pale. "We have to leave. I don't like this." For once, Eric wasn't joking. "Yeah, maybe we should call it quits." But Mark was already moving toward the trees. "Mark, stop," I hissed, following him. "This is crazy." He didn't stop. He kept walking toward the voice, his expression blank, as if he were in a trance. I reached out, grabbing him and pulling him back, just as a figure emerged from the fog, the same gaunt figure we'd seen earlier. It stood at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its eyes hollow black pits. My blood turned to ice. "What is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, its body moving in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't know how to walk properly. Then, with a sickening crack, it twisted its head to the side, staring at us with those empty, soulless eyes. Mark stumbled back, snapping out of whatever trance had held him. We need to go now." The four of us rushed to the RV, slamming the door shut behind us. Outside, the figure circled the clearing, watching us, waiting. The next few hours were a blur of panic. We tried to start the RV, but the engines sputtered and died. The flashlight batteries drained within minutes. Every time we looked outside, the figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. "We're trapped," Eric muttered, pacing the small space of the RV. "What the hell is that thing?" "It's not real," I said, though even I wasn't sure anymore. "It can't be." But it was, and it wasn't going anywhere. Mark sat in the corner, his head in his hands. "It's the Wendigo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, staring at him. "The Wendigo," he repeated. "It's an old Native American legend, a spirit of insatiable hunger. It drives people mad, makes them turn on each other." "That's ridiculous," I said, but my voice shook. "I've heard of it," Eric said, his face pale. "It feeds on fear and hunger." A cold realization washed over me, the constant hunger we'd all been feeling, the strange cravings, the paranoia. Everything had started the moment we'd arrived. "It's trying to drive us mad," Mark said, his eyes wild. "That's why it hasn't attacked. It wants us to destroy each other." By the time night fell, the Wendigo was closer, standing just outside the RV, its gaunt, twisted face pressed against the window, its fingers tapping softly on the glass. Jessica couldn't take it anymore. "I have to get out of here," she screamed, bolting for the door. "Wait," I shouted, but it was too late. She was already outside, running into the woods. We rushed after her, but the fog swallowed her whole. I could hear her screaming, her voice echoing through the trees, and then silence. We found her body a few minutes later. Her limbs were twisted, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The Wendigo stood over her, watching, its empty eyes locked on us. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaking now. We stumbled back to the RV, but as we slammed the door shut, I saw the look in Mark's eyes. The hunger had taken hold of him. He was muttering to himself, his eyes darting toward me, then Eric. "He's not right," Eric whispered. "It's inside him." Mark lunged at me, his hands grasping at my throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't stop it." I struggled, pushing him off, and he collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Eric grabbed a metal pipe and stood over him, ready to strike if he tried again. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The Wendigo was still outside, waiting. As we approached, the fog began to lift. We packed what little we could carry and made a run for it, leaving the RV behind. The Wendigo didn't follow. It just watched, its hollow eyes locked onto us as we disappeared down the trail. Even now, I can still feel its gaze, like it's always there, just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I'll never go back to the wilderness again. Not after what I've seen. Not after what we've done. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last, but something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70 heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive, needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister. Bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. No, not tapping. Scratching. It was coming from the crate. A large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, and I jumped in my seat. Static. Then through the fuzz, I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people, ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but There was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again. Then came the knocking. Loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes. But I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open, and then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out. One voice I knew. Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust I could see them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar, faces I'd seen on the road before, long dead truckers, friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her, Carol, standing in the middle of the road. Her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it skidded across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal, no way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again. Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. Roy, she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. It's time to come home. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. It had been 3 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head and reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. Perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds, just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. Must be a deer, I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here, alone, with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank, but the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head. Every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence, but something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up, and the air felt heavier, somehow oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time, I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight, tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that, vanished, as if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant, oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head, but something about the way the air felt today, something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again. A figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stomped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing, not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them, not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees. Their bodies blended with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow, I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, but the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore, just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again, the silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the window, screaming, but of course no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react, but as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me, but there was nothing, just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I know that one day they'll come for me again. This time I won't be able to run. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The brown mountain lights were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even, but as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else, tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need, high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. and anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. 2, 3 lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen, dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for, the lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees Fahrenheit? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger, too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast, no way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable, but now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces, staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow, and there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints, dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal and the frost melted away, but I didn't feel safe, not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the brown mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew deep down that the lights weren't just a phenomenon, they were something more. Something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. The forest was supposed to be my escape. I drove the RV deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, hoping the solitude would offer some kind of peace. I had been out here a few times before. Never this deep, though, but it had always been calming. Nature had a way of quieting the noise in my head. After I left the job, the silence became my companion, even though it haunted me with memories I wasn't ready to face. The accident that had ended my career as a paramedic. Every night, it replayed in my mind, always the same horrific details. But with each viewing, I saw a new way I could have saved the child. A different decision, a split second sooner, and maybe it didn't matter. I was here now, alone. The sound of the gravel crunched under my tires as I parked off an old dirt road. It was oddly satisfying. I turned off the engine, and for a moment there was bliss. No noise except for the rustle of trees in the wind. This was what I needed. No sirens, no screaming. Just the mountains. I grabbed my bag and climbed out, stretching my legs before heading over to the old fire lookout tower nearby. It was a relic, long abandoned and forgotten by most hikers. The wood was graying, peeling away from years of exposure, but it stood firm, a silent sentinel watching over the rolling hills. Something about the place had always intrigued me. It had a gravity to it, like it was holding secrets that only those who ventured close enough could learn. I planned to spend the weekend here, at least 3 days before I had to go back to reality. I didn't need much, just the stillness, the mountains, and a break from the memories. I set up camp near the RV, built a small fire, and tried to let go. But the quiet was different this time. The first night, it started with whispers. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames flicker against the trees when I thought I heard voices. Not nearby, but carried on the wind. Faint, like a conversation just out of reach. I strained to listen, but they faded, lost in the rustle of the leaves. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the quiet, while peaceful, was unnerving in its own way. After a while, I retreated to the RV, exhausted, but the voices lingered in the back of my mind, soft murmurs that tugged at my thoughts. As I lay down, I told myself it was nothing, just echoes of people who had camped here long before. The wind could carry sounds in strange ways out here, but the deeper I fell into sleep, the louder they grew, until I jerked awake, covered in sweat. There were no voices, just the oppressive weight of silence. I stared at the ceiling, the same question running through my mind. Was this peace or something else? The next morning, things started to get strange. I woke to find my watch blinking, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I tapped the screen a few times, but it refused to budge. Strange. When I checked my phone, it was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I chalked it up to bad luck, but when I stepped out of the RV, the sun seemed higher in the sky than it should have been. It was late morning, but it felt like I had only just fallen asleep. I spent the day hiking, keeping my mind occupied. The trail was familiar. I'd hiked this ridge before, but something about it felt different. Landmarks I swore I'd seen on the way up seemed out of place, or worse, missing. And every time I thought I was making progress, I'd find myself right back where I started. The same twisted tree, the same rock formation. A loop. The disorientation didn't set in all at once. It was a slow, creeping unease that settled in my bones. The wind felt wrong too, as if it was carrying something. I couldn't quite hear those whispers again, faint, distorted, carried on the breeze. This time, they were closer. By nightfall, the voices were louder. They weren't whispers anymore, but full conversations, disembodied words spoken in tones I couldn't place. It was like someone was just out of view, talking, laughing. At first, I stayed by the fire, trying to block it out, but the longer I sat there, the clearer the voices became. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as if they were replaying over and over, fragments of words lost on the wind. I stood up, scanning the tree line. Shadows flickered just beyond the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking in the stillness. No answer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I watched the shadows shift. A figure. It moved between the trees, far enough that I couldn't see clearly, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. But when I took a step toward it, it vanished, gone as if it had never been there. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam of light revealed nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks again, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something here, something I didn't understand. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. But even inside, the silence was heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices were still there, faint now, but constant. It felt like someone was standing just outside the RV, talking in circles over and over. The next morning, I hiked to the old fire lookout. I don't know why. Something about the tower drew me in, like I needed to be there. It was old, dilapidated, and crumbling, but it held a strange power. When I reached the top, I could see for miles. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched out in every direction, green and endless. I expected to feel some sense of peace, but instead a deep dread settled in my chest. The lookout wasn't empty. It was filled with the remnants of people who had come here before me. Old camping gear, torn sleeping bags, cans of food long since expired, graffiti scratched into the wooden beams, names etched into the walls. And something else. Carved into the center of the floor was a symbol. A crude spiral looping in on itself. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. It looked old, weathered, like it had been there forever. The voices returned, this time louder, clearer. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the tower was empty. Just the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. I ran my hands through my hair, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong here. The ridge, the lookout, it wasn't just an old campsite. It was a trap, a loop, and I was stuck in it. I tried to leave that afternoon, packed up the RV, started the engine, and drove down the winding road that had brought me here. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape didn't change. The trees, the rocks, it all blurred together. The same stretches of road repeating over and over. After what felt like hours, I found myself back at the campsite, the fire now cold and dead, sitting in the exact same spot. My heart sank. I tried again. This time I took a different route, but once again the RV looped back to the same spot. It was as if the mountain wouldn't let me leave. By nightfall, I knew the truth. The whispers weren't random, they weren't in my head. They were echoes of the past, of people who had been here before me, people who had tried to leave and failed. I sat in the RV, staring out the window at the darkening woods. The figures had returned. This time there were more of them. They moved between the trees, watching me, waiting. One by one, they stepped into the clearing, surrounding the RV. I could see them now, faded, distorted, like shadows of people long gone. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate. They said nothing, but I could hear them. Their voices, the same words looping over and over. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. This was it. I was stuck, trapped in their endless loop, just like they were. The door creaked open. I don't remember what happened next, only that I woke up the next morning sitting by the cold, dead fire. The RV door was wide open, the woods empty and still. But the whispers were gone. For now. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks. Time doesn't seem to work the same way anymore. Every time I think I'm getting closer to an answer, I find myself right back where I started. I'm not alone on this ridge. There are others. I can hear them sometimes, their voices echoing. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest, not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. Gifford Piney National Forest had been Karen's idea years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then, too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street, just like that, she was gone. And I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything, that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there, watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before, Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond, but his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk. Anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol, It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals, spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to... Well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking to the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoors woman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped. Dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door when I saw it. Movement, just at the edge of the trees, a figure tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was happening? I sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. It didn't make sense. People didn't just vanish like that, not without a trace. I thought about Edgar, about the stories he'd told, the forgotten one, he'd called it. A legend about a man who'd wandered too far into the forest, losing himself until he became part of the land itself. Now they said he lured others to join him, preying on their grief, their loneliness, until they disappeared too. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But Leah was gone, and the symbols were still there, etched into the trees like a warning or an invitation. The footsteps returned that night, and this time I knew what they wanted. I could hear her voice, Karen's voice, calling to me from the trees, soft, loving, like she was right there, waiting for me. "Derek," she whispered, "come find me." My heart ached, torn between the impossible and the undeniable. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it, but I wanted to believe it was. I stepped outside, The cold air bit at my skin. The forest was dark, silent, but the voice was there, guiding me. I walked toward the trees, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Derek," she called again. "Don't leave me." I stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. I could see her now, just beyond the first row of trees, her face, her smile. She was there, waiting for me. But something was wrong. The shadows around her shifted, twisting like they were alive. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were hollow, empty. I took a step back, the spell breaking. This wasn't Karen. I turned and ran back to the RV, back to safety. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in as the voice grew louder, angrier. "Derek!" I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear her screaming my name from the trees, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left Gifford Pinon the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them, and whatever it was out there, whatever the forgotten one truly was, it would stay there, waiting for someone else. I wasn't running away from my problems. I was just trying to get some space. That's what I told myself, at least, after the divorce. Everything felt too close, too suffocating. The paperwork, the empty house, the awkward conversations with friends who didn't know how to bring it up. I needed to get away, and what better way than a solo trip into the wilderness? Dead Man's Creek sounded like the perfect place to clear my head. A name so bleak it made the reality of my situation seem trivial. Just me, my dog Max, and the open road. I had driven the RV deep into Wyoming's Wind River Range, far from the trails and tourists. That's what I wanted, solitude. I found a spot off the grid and well off the beaten path. The closest human was probably miles away, which suited me just fine. I set up camp near a bend in the creek, the water dark and slow, reflecting the towering pines above. The quiet was absolute, and I felt something like relief as I stood there, staring out at the wilderness, Max sniffing the ground beside me. "This is it, boy," I said, running my hand through his thick fur. "Just us. No distractions." Max wagged his tail, but his ears were perked, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. The place was still, too still. But that's what I wanted, wasn't it? Peace. Quiet. No one to tell me what I'd done wrong or how I'd lost everything. Just the wide open woods and the whisper of the creek. The first night was fine. Quiet. Uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the campfire, Max stretched out at my feet. The stars were sharp and cold in the sky, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But that peace didn't last. The second night I noticed it. The silence. Not the calming, tranquil kind, but a deeper, unnatural stillness. There was no rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, no movement in the trees, just the crackling of the fire and the low, constant murmur of the creek. Max, who usually dozed off by now, was alert, staring out into the dark, his ears flat against his head. "What is it, boy?" I asked, standing up and scanning the tree line. Nothing but shadows stretching between the pines. Still, Max didn't relax. His body was stiff, and every few seconds, he let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight from the RV and shone it toward the woods, sweeping the beam across the darkness. Just trees, no glowing eyes, no movement. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and relaxed. Probably just a deer or something. But Max didn't relax. He growled again, deeper this time. His fur bristled. The flashlight flickered. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint smell. Something rotten, like decayed meat left out in the sun. I wrinkled my nose, holding my breath for a moment. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that the wilderness was full of strange smells, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I tossed another log onto the fire. The flames flared up with a loud crack. For a moment, the smell faded and the wind died down. Max settled a little but remained close to me, never taking his eyes off the woods. It was only later, when I was lying in bed in the RV, that I heard it, soft at first, like a distant whisper. Crying. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound drifted through the trees, carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a woman crying. My first thought was that maybe someone was out there, lost in the woods, but no one else should be anywhere near this area. I hadn't seen a single car, a single hiker, nothing. Help me. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the murmur of the creek. But it was there, clear as day. Max growled again, this time from his spot at the foot of the bed. He was staring at the door now, his body tense, ears flat. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and crept toward the door. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the door and ignore whatever was out there. But that voice, it was so desperate. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cool night air. The flashlight flickered to life, the beam cutting through the darkness. The crying had stopped. The forest was still again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too human for this unnatural quiet. "Is anyone there?" No answer. Just the sound of the creek and the rustling of the trees. Max stayed at my side, his growl low and steady. Then I saw them. Footprints. Large, old-fashioned boot prints in the damp soil near the creek's edge. They weren't mine, and they certainly weren't recent. The edges of the prints were weathered as if they had been there for weeks, but that was impossible. I backed up, my heart pounding, pulling Max with me. I didn't sleep much that night, the echo of the crying woman replaying in my head. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my mind. Too many nights alone in the wilderness, maybe a little too much whiskey by the fire. But something gnawed at me. Those boot prints, the voice, the smell of rot. Something was wrong here. I needed answers. I spent the afternoon hiking deeper into the woods, staying close to the creek. That's when I found it. An old campsite, or what was left of one at least, a broken down wagon, rusted tools scattered in the dirt, and a few rotting planks of wood that might have once been part of a shelter. As I looked closer, I spotted something in the dirt, a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Carefully, I opened it, flipping through the delicate pages. The writing was faded, but I could make out enough. It belonged to a woman, a pioneer, by the sound of it, who had traveled west with her family. They had camped near Dead Man's Creek, just like I had. Her entries were brief at first, describing their journey and the hardships they faced, but the later entries grew darker, more frantic. The cold is setting in. We lost Joseph last night. He wandered too far from the fire, and we couldn't find him. I hear him sometimes calling out to me from the trees, but when I go to him, he's not there. My children, they're gone too, taken by the woods, by the creek. I can't leave. I have to find them. I have to. The final entry trailed off, the ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted. My stomach turned, and a chill crawled down my spine. I knew the legend of the crying woman, how she had lost her family in these woods and now wandered them, searching for her lost loved ones. I'd heard it mentioned in passing by locals when I'd asked for directions to the creek, but I'd brushed it off as folklore. But now I wasn't so sure. That night, the crying returned, but this time it was closer, louder. The weeping echoed through the trees, wrapping around the RV like a thick fog. "Help me, please." Max growled, his hackles raised as he paced near the door. I sat at the table, gripping the edge with white knuckles, my heart racing. The woman was out there, and she knew I was here. The RV began to shake, the windows rattling as if something or someone was moving around outside. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay inside forever. I opened the door. The flashlight beam cut through the dark. The crying stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The rotten smell was back, stronger this time, like it was coming from just a few feet away. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, her figure barely visible in the flickering light of the campfire. Her skin was pale, her clothes torn and stained with dirt. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face, and when she looked up at me, her eyes, dark, hollow, and wet with tears, seemed to stare right through me. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and broken, "help me find them." I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground as the woman took a step toward me. Her presence was cold, so cold that the air around her seemed to freeze. Max barked, snapping me out of my paralysis. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're not real. You can't be real." But she was, and she wasn't leaving. "Please," she begged, reaching out a skeletal hand. "My children." I could feel the temperature drop even further as she drew closer. The journal. I thought of the journal I had found by the creek, the story of her lost family, her desperation. She was still searching for them, even in death. And if I didn't do something, she would never stop. I grabbed the journal from the RV and ran toward the creek. The crying woman followed me, her wails growing louder, more desperate. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the water's edge, holding the journal in my shaking hands. "Your family's gone," I said, my voice trembling. "They're gone. You need to rest." She stopped, standing at the edge of the creek, her dark eyes fixed on the journal I placed on the ground by the water, as if offering her some kind of closure. For a moment, the weeping faded and the wind died down. The crying woman stared at the journal, then at me. Her eyes softened just for a second, and then she was gone. I left Dead Man's Creek the next morning, the journal still lying by the water where I'd placed it. As I drove away, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Max sat beside me, his head resting on my lap, finally calm. I'll never forget the sound of the weeping or the hollow eyes of the crying woman. She's still out there somewhere, searching for something she'll never find, and I'll never return to those woods. Not again. My name is Mila Williams, and I'm 30 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in October, just a few months ago, at Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa. It started as a simple camping trip with my brother Eli, his best friend Mia, and her boyfriend Derek, but it became something none of us could have ever imagined. I thought a weekend out in nature would help us all reconnect. My brother and I hadn't been close for years. Years of college, work, and life had gotten in the way. Mia suggested making it a group thing, hoping it would take the pressure off. Derek brought the gear, and I brought the food. We thought we were prepared. We weren't. We reached the park on a chilly Friday afternoon. The trees, still heavy with autumn leaves, glowed red and gold in the late-day sun. Effigy Mounds is known for its eerie beauty, ancient burial mounds shaped like animals dotting the forest. Local legends talk about spirits protecting the land, but we brushed those stories off as just that. Stories. The ranger who checked us in, a wiry man with weathered skin, gave us a look when I mentioned our campsite deep in the forest. "Respect the land," he said, "and it might respect you back." I laughed nervously, thinking he was just playing up the mystique of the place. Eli rolled his eyes, muttering something about tourist traps. I shot him a look, but let it go. He never took anything seriously. By sunset, we'd set up camp near the river. Derek, ever the Boy Scout, had gotten a fire going, and Mia had convinced us to toast marshmallows even before dinner. It was peaceful. I should have enjoyed it more, but something about the forest felt off. Too quiet, too still. The first strange thing happened after we'd gone to bed. We were crammed into 2 tents because Eli's was torn, a fact he conveniently neglected to mention until we got there. I shared one with Mia while Derek and Eli took the other. The ground was hard and the air was freezing, but I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound outside. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then I heard it clearly, a low, mournful cry that carried through the night. It wasn't an animal. I'd been camping enough to know the difference between a coyote's howl and whatever this was. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mia. She was already awake, her eyes wide. "Probably a deer," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. In the other tent, Derek stirred. "What is that?" he called out. "Go back to sleep," Eli groaned, always the skeptic. None of us got much rest after that. The next morning, I found my jacket shredded and hanging from a low branch about 20 feet from camp. It looked like something had clawed it to pieces, though Derek insisted it must have gotten caught on the brambles when I wasn't looking. "I didn't take it off," I said, holding up the ruined fabric. "It was inside the tent." Eli shrugged. "A raccoon, maybe." "A raccoon didn't do this," I snapped, but I dropped it. I didn't want to ruin the trip over something I couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking the trails, passing by several of the burial mounds. They were unsettling, even in broad daylight. The largest, shaped like a bear, loomed over us, its contours stark against the blue sky. Mia lingered, snapping photos while Derek muttered about staying on schedule. "Come on," he said. "We've got to get back before dark." He was right. By the time we returned to camp, the shadows were long and the air had turned icy. The fire felt like our only protection against the creeping dark. That night, things escalated. Around midnight, Eli woke me up, shaking my arm. "Mila," he hissed. "I heard you calling me." "I was asleep," I said groggily, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It was your voice," he insisted. "Out in the woods." My stomach turned. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, but I'd heard something too, a faint whispering just outside the tent. So quiet, I couldn't make out the words. We huddled by the fire, all four of us. Mia was trying to stay calm, but her hands trembled as she held her mug of coffee. Derek kept scanning the trees, his flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks. Then Mia froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing into the darkness. We all turned. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I saw it too, a pale figure standing just beyond the firelight. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, and then it was gone, slipping into the shadows like smoke. "What the hell was that?" Derek whispered. No one had an answer. We should have left then, but Derek convinced us to stay. "It's just some weird local wildlife," he said. "We'll leave tomorrow." That morning, Mia grew distant. Her usual bubbly energy was replaced with something cold and sharp. She stared off into the woods as if listening to something none of us could hear. "I think we should go," I said, but Eli scoffed. "You're overreacting." Am I? I wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to give him another reason to think I was being dramatic. That evening, Derek wandered off to relieve himself and came back different. He was quieter, his movements slower, as if something was weighing him down. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded, avoiding eye contact. By the time the sun set, the forest felt alive, pressing in on us from all sides. The whispers were louder now, no longer confined to the edge of hearing. They were all around us. "Marcus," the voice was mine this time, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. "Help me." Eli stood, his face pale. "Mila, stop it." "It's not me," I said, my voice trembling. The night was chaos. Derek attacked first, lunging at Eli with a strength that didn't seem human. His eyes were wild, his mouth twisting into an unnatural snarl. It took all three of us to restrain him, tying him to a tree with the last of our rope. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice shaking. "We can't just leave him like this," I protested. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure he was still Derek. His head lolled forward, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were black as pitch. The whispers grew louder, joined by rustling all around us. The pale figures emerged from the trees. More of them this time. Their forms were wrong, too tall, their limbs too long, their faces blank and hollow. "They're skinwalkers," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Offerings," she said. "We have to appease them." We piled everything we had by the fire, food, clothes, anything of value, but it wasn't enough. The figures kept advancing, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Finally, I made a decision. "Run," I told Eli and Mia. "I'll hold them off." "Mila, no," Eli shouted, but I shoved him toward the trees. "Go," I screamed. I turned to face the creatures, clutching a burning branch from the fire. "You want me?" I shouted. "Come and get me." I don't remember much after that. The last thing I saw was Eli and Mia disappearing into the trees as the creatures closed in. Then everything went dark. They told me weeks later that Eli returned with the search party, but they found no trace of me, just my shredded jacket hanging from a tree near the burial mounds. Now I'm here, writing this down, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe someone will read this and think twice before venturing too deep into effigy mounds. Respect the land and pray it respects you back. In 1991, I left behind the chaos of city life and settled in a remote cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. My name is Tom Trey, and I'll be the first to admit that moving off the grid was as much about escaping people as it was about the appeal of nature. People are messy, complicated. Trees, rivers, not so much. It's not that I don't like people, I just like them better when they're far away. My cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a hammock I strung up in the corner, and a basic kitchen I built myself. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away, and I was perfectly fine with that. I had a dog named Murphy for company, and between the two of us, we were pretty content with our little bubble of wilderness isolation. That morning, I had decided to head further into the forest than usual, maybe explore some parts I hadn't yet. I'd been feeling restless lately. The kind of itch you get when the quiet becomes a little too loud, you know? I figured a long hike would do the trick. I packed up my rifle, never left home without it, and headed off with Murphy trailing at my heels. Murphy wasn't a big dog, some kind of mutt with a mix of husky and who knows what else, but he was a good boy. Always stuck close, rarely barked unless there was a reason. We set off into the trees, the air thick with that damp, earthy smell that only deep woods have. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, until even the birds seemed to vanish from the soundscape. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought we were walking through an abandoned forest. About 2 hours in, Murphy stopped dead, ears up, nose twitching. I stopped too. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the trees around us. It wasn't unusual for him to react to a deer or some other critter, but the way he stood tense and still told me something was off. I gripped my rifle tighter. Whatever it wasn't anything familiar. Murphy let out a low whine and took a few steps backward. That's when I heard it, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking, but louder, more deliberate. The kind of sound that isn't an accident. I whipped around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the trees seemed to close in around me, the dense brush making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Hello?" I called out. I don't know why. It's not like I expected an answer, but something in my gut told me I wasn't alone anymore. Another snap, this time closer, and I saw movement. Something big, just beyond the trees. My first thought was a bear, but it moved too quickly, too fluidly for that. Whatever it wasn't an animal I recognized. My heart started to race, and Murphy growled, a low, deep sound I'd never heard him make before. Without thinking, I raised the rifle and aimed it in the direction of the noise. "Show yourself," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response, just the eerie silence that seemed to swallow up everything else. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, it was real. All right. It was about 7 feet tall, covered in patchy, mangy fur like it had been rolling in mud for days. Its legs were long and spindly, almost like a deer's, but the torso was hunched and muscular, more like a primate. The face, if you could call it that, was somewhere between a wolf and a human, the mouth too wide, filled with sharp teeth that seemed more suited for tearing flesh than anything else. I know it sounds crazy, but there it was, standing not 30 feet from me, staring me down with an intent I couldn't place. My hands were shaking, and for the first time I wasn't sure if my rifle would do any good. It was like looking at something out of a nightmare. Murphy growled again, louder this time, and the thing took a step forward. It didn't run, didn't charge, just a single calculated step. I didn't need any more encouragement. I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees, and the creature let out a sound that I can only describe as a howl of pain and fury. It staggered back, but it didn't go down. Blood, thick and dark, oozed from the wound in its chest, but it didn't seem to slow the thing down. If anything, it just pissed it off. I fired again. This time it let out a snarl, a sound so guttural that it vibrated in my chest. Murphy barked and lunged at it, but I grabbed his collar, pulling him back before he could get too close. The thing wasn't running, but it wasn't retreating either. It just stood there, watching, as if deciding whether to finish me off. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted into the trees, moving faster than anything that size had any right to. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed Murphy, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and ran. By the time we made it back to the cabin, I was gasping for air, heart pounding out of my chest. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, even though I knew a wooden door wasn't going to stop something like that if it wanted to get in. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the silence outside, waiting. But nothing came. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning I decided I needed to do something about it. Heading into town to tell the sheriff wasn't an option. I wasn't about to be labeled the crazy guy who sees monsters in the woods, but I couldn't just stay there waiting for it to come back. I packed up my truck, loaded Murphy in, and headed out. I figured I could lay low in town for a few days, maybe get some perspective on what had happened. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I saw something lying at the edge of the trees, something that hadn't been there the day before. It was a body. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, heart racing as I approached. It was a man, or what was left of him. His torso had been torn open, rib cage exposed, guts spilled out onto the forest floor. His face was mangled, unrecognizable, but the worst part was the claw marks, deep gouges raked across his chest and arms like he'd been attacked by something with hands, not paws. Hands. Murphy barked, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the corpse. I knew what had done it. I knew what had been lurking out there, and I knew that it wasn't gone. I called the sheriff anonymously, telling them there was a body by the road. Then I left town, far away from the Bitterroot Mountains, far away from whatever was out there. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it had seen me, and I had a feeling it wasn't the kind of creature that let people walk away. This happened in late October, the week before Halloween. My name is Clara Reynolds, and I'm 33 years old. I've spent the past 2 years living out of my RV, documenting my travels across the Midwest for my blog, Roadside Reveries. It's not the life I imagined for myself, certainly not the one I was planning with my fiancée, but it's where I've ended up. Some days it feels like healing. Other days it feels like running. That week, I decided to camp at Mystery Cave State Park in southern Minnesota. I'd read about its underground cave systems and miles of pine-covered trails, and it seemed like the perfect blend of beauty and solitude. I thought I'd get some good photos, write a couple of posts, and enjoy the quiet. I was wrong. When I pulled into the park visitor center, the parking lot was nearly empty. A grizzled park ranger with a gray beard and a stained uniform sat behind the desk, sipping coffee from a thermos. He looked up when I walked in and gave me a polite nod. "Afternoon. What can I do for you?" "I'm here to camp for a few days," I said, setting my notebook on the counter. "I've got an RV, so I'll need a hookup spot." His brow furrowed. "You're here alone?" "Yeah," I said, trying not to sound defensive. "You sure about that?" His eyes lingered on my face, and for a moment I thought he was going to outright tell me no. Then he sighed and reached for a map. "We're getting close to off-season," he said. "Not many folks around. You'll have most of the park to yourself, but I wouldn't recommend camping near the caves. The terrain's unstable, and there have been odd things reported." "What kind of odd things?" He hesitated. "Whispers, shadows where there shouldn't be, stuff that spooks people, nothing concrete." I laughed nervously. "You get a lot of ghost stories around here?" "More than you'd think." He tapped the map, circling a spot near the caves. "If I were you, I'd steer clear of this area. The Pines campground is safer, and it's got a better view." I nodded, but as I walked back to my RV, I found myself drawn to the circled area. Whispers or not, I wanted to see the caves. By the time I reached the clearing near the caves, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the pines. I parked my RV, leveled it, and stepped outside to take in the view. The air was crisp and still, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just silence. I shook off the unease and started setting up. The site itself was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. I cooked a quick dinner on my portable stove, then settled in with a book. That night, the whispers started. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched murmuring like voices just outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding. "Hello? Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voices stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. The forest loomed around me, dark and impenetrable. As I turned back to the RV, my light caught something on the rear window, a smudge low to the ground, shaped like a handprint. I told myself it was condensation, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I decided to hike to the caves. The whispers still nagged at the back of my mind, but I convinced myself it was my imagination. The sunlight filtering through the trees bolstered my confidence. The cave entrance was marked by a rusted metal sign that read, "Do not enter without a guide." Of course, the sign was half buried in overgrown grass, and the entrance was wide open. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the gloom. That's when I saw the plaque. It was bolted to the cave wall, weathered and faded, in memory of the children who were lost, 1963. Beneath the text was a black and white photograph. 5 children, smiling awkwardly at the camera, flanked by a stern-looking ranger. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what had happened to them, but I felt an undeniable pull to find out. I spent the afternoon at the visitor center's archive room, digging through old newspapers and park records. What I found made my stomach turn. The 5 children had gone missing during a school field trip in 1963. Search parties combed the caves and surrounding woods for weeks, but no trace of them was ever found. The ranger in the photo, William Graves, disappeared shortly afterward. Rumors swirled about foul play, with some accusing Graves of leading the children into the caves and abandoning them. Others whispered that the caves themselves had taken them, that something dark and ancient lurked beneath the park. I left the archives feeling a strange mix of dread and curiosity. That night, the haunting escalated. I was cooking dinner when the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from all around me, weaving through the trees, brushing against the RV like the wind. "Who's out there?" I shouted, stepping outside with my flashlight. The beam swept across the trees and stopped on a figure. It was small, childlike, with glowing eyes that reflected the light. My breath caught in my throat. Then it was gone, darting behind a tree faster than anything human. I scrambled back into the RV and locked the door. My heart thundered in my chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I huddled in the corner, clutching a kitchen knife and praying for morning. By dawn, I'd had enough. I decided to pack up and leave. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the cables, everything looked fine, but the RV refused to turn over. That's when I saw the footprints, dozens of them circling the RV. Small, barefoot prints leading from the woods to the clearing and back again. I felt my stomach drop. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let me go. I spent the day trying to find a way out. My phone had no signal, and the park radio tower was too far to reach on foot. Before nightfall, desperation drove me to hike back to the caves, hoping I could find something, anything that might explain what was happening. The air inside the cave felt heavier this time, almost oppressive. The whispers were louder, echoing off the walls as I ventured deeper. I found an old ranger station tucked into a side tunnel. It was dilapidated, with broken furniture and mold creeping up the walls. On the desk, I found a leather-bound journal. It belonged to William Graves. The journal's entries were disjointed, filled with ramblings about the voices and the children. Graves wrote about how they'd lured him into the caves with their laughter, promising him eternal life if he stayed with them. I hear them calling me even now, one entry read. Their voices are soft, sweet, but there is something wrong beneath the sweetness, something hungry. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. They won't let me leave. They are not children anymore. They are something else. A noise behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, and there he was. The figure in the doorway was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His uniform hung in tatters, and his hands ended in claws. "Help me," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. I stumbled backward, dropping the journal. The whispers surged around me, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. Graves lunged, and I bolted, running deeper into the caves. The passages twisted and turned, disorienting me, but I didn't stop. I burst into a chamber filled with skeletal remains. The bones were small, scattered across the floor like discarded toys. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at, the missing children. The whispers turned into screams as Graves appeared in the entrance, his form twisting and stretching unnaturally. I grabbed a flare from my bag, striking it with trembling hands. The chamber filled with red light, and the spirits recoiled, their outlines flickering like shadows. With a desperate cry, I threw the flare into the pile of bones. Flames erupted, consuming the remains and illuminating the chamber. Graves let out an inhuman wail, his body dissolving into ash as the fire burned brighter. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I stumbled out of the cave just as the sun began to set. My RV started without a hitch, as though nothing had ever been wrong. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a single handprint on the window, smaller than my own. I haven't been back to Mystery Cave since, and I never will. It started off like any other camping trip. I was out in my RV enjoying the peace and quiet of the Appalachian Mountains. I had always found solace in nature, especially after my divorce last year. I thought a solo trip would clear my head and help me reconnect with myself. My name's Warren Grady. I'm not one to dwell on the past, but let's just say life hasn't been a smooth ride. I've had my share of ups and downs, and this trip was supposed to be an up for me, a little escape from the daily grind. The campsite was perfect, nestled in a small clearing with tall pines all around. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine needles filled my lungs. I parked the RV, set up my little fire pit, and settled into my chair with a cold beer. Everything seemed perfect. As dusk fell, I noticed a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. Being a curious guy, I decided to follow it, hoping to find a good spot for fishing in the morning. The trail was narrow and overgrown, clearly not used much. I walked for about 20 minutes, the sounds of nature my only companion, until I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were broken, the wood rotting, and the door hung off its hinges. Something about the place gave me the creeps, but I brushed it off. It was just an old cabin, right? I made a mental note to avoid it and headed back to my campsite. The fire was still burning when I returned, casting flickering shadows around the clearing. I cooked a simple meal, had a couple more beers, and decided to call it a night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard whispers. Faint, almost inaudible, but definitely human. My heart raced as I reached for the flashlight and my hunting knife. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing I expected was company. I peeked out of the RV window but saw nothing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the rustling of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed, though it took a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease. The memory of the whispers lingered in my mind, but the bright sunlight made it seem almost silly. I decided to shake it off and enjoy my day. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed back to the trail. The cabin looked even more eerie in the daylight. I walked past it, feeling its presence like a weight on my shoulders. The trail eventually led to a beautiful, secluded stream. I set up my gear and spent the next few hours in peaceful solitude, catching a few fish and enjoying the quiet. On my way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. The door of the cabin, which had been hanging off its hinges the previous day, was now closed. I froze, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone had been there. I approached the cabin cautiously, knife in hand. I knocked on the door, half expecting it to fall off its hinges, but it stayed put. There was no answer. I pushed the door open slowly and peered inside. The interior was dark and musty, with broken furniture strewn about. There was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting on the floor. It was a small metal locket. I picked it up and examined it. Inside was a faded photo of a woman and a little girl. I slipped it into my pocket, intending to take it to the local authorities when I got back to town. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the fire burning high and stayed close to the RV. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the whispers again, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, determined to find the source. I followed the sound into the woods, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The whispers led me back to the cabin. This time, the door was wide open. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, leading me to a trapdoor in the corner of the room. I hesitated for a moment, then lifted the trapdoor. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness. I descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, I found a small dirt-floored cellar. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate. The whispers stopped as I approached the crate. I pried it open with my knife, revealing a gruesome sight. Inside were the skeletal remains of several people, their bones twisted and broken. My stomach churned as I backed away, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, knife ready, and came face to face with a man. He was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and eyes that gleamed with madness. He lunged at me, and we struggled, rolling across the dirt floor. I slashed at him with the knife, but he was strong and relentless. He pinned me to the ground, his hands around my throat. I fought back with all my strength, managing to throw him off. He stumbled, hitting his head on the edge of the crate. He lay still, blood pooling around his head. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. My hands shook as I picked up the flashlight and knife. I needed to get out of there, to get help. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear the whispers again, fainter now, almost pleading. I ran back to the RV, my mind racing. I needed to get to the nearest town and report what I had found. I packed up my things quickly, my hands still trembling. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, silent and ominous, as if watching me leave. I made it to the nearest town and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, showed them the locket, and led them back to the cabin. The sheriff and his deputies searched the place thoroughly. They found the remains in the cellar and identified them as several missing persons from the past decade. The man I had fought was a drifter, a serial killer who had been hiding in the woods for years. He had been using the cabin as his hideout, luring campers and hikers to their deaths. The whispers I had heard were from his victims, their voices lingering in the place where they had met their end. The authorities thanked me for my help and assured me that the man would never harm anyone again. They took the locket to identify the woman and child in the photo and to bring closure to their families. As I drove back home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I had survived something horrific, and in doing so had helped bring justice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. The memories of that night would stay with me, but I wouldn't let them haunt me. I was stronger than that. I continued to camp and enjoy the great outdoors, but I was always more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. The wilderness held many secrets, and I had learned that some of them were darker than I could have ever imagined. In the end, I didn't let fear control me. I faced it head on and came out stronger. As I sat by the campfire on my next trip, I knew that I was truly free. What began as a simple trip to reconnect with old friends quickly spiraled into a nightmare I still can't escape. The terror of that day is seared into my mind, a constant presence that shadows my every step. My name is Ethan Greyfeather, born of Choctaw descent in the rolling hills of Oklahoma, though life in the heart of Kansas City has been my home for years. But when my old friend Joseph Red Clay invited me back to the reservation for a weekend of hunting and camaraderie, I couldn't resist. It had been far too long since I'd felt the pull of home. The smell of pine, the cool whisper of the wind in the trees. This was in late October of 1988, deep in the Pisgah National Forest, where the trees stand like ancient sentinels and the earth seems to pulse with something primordial. The plan had been simple enough. Joseph, his cousin Daniel, and I would set traps, track game, and then return to Joseph's family cabin for storytelling and a hearty meal. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and the forest seemed to welcome us like old friends. But something dark lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for us. The morning passed without incident. Joseph was in his element, explaining the ways of the forest, the deer trails, the herbs his grandmother used to heal the sick. Daniel, ever the joker, teased me relentlessly about my city hands and how rusty my bow skills had become. By midday, we'd set up camp near a slow-moving creek, its waters darkened by the canopy above. The silence of the woods was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional call of a raven. As the sun dipped lower, Joseph suggested we split up to cover more ground. "Stay within earshot," he warned, his tone unusually serious. "These woods aren't as empty as they seem." I nodded, slinging my bow over my shoulder and heading northwest. The terrain was uneven, tangled with brambles and fallen logs. As I crouched to inspect tracks, 2 bucks, maybe more, my senses were on high alert. It was as though the forest itself held its breath. The sharp snap of a twig underfoot felt like a gunshot in the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. And then it happened. The forest fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the faintest whisper of wind. My breath caught in my throat as an acrid metallic scent filled the air, one I couldn't place, but that instantly set my nerves on edge. Something was wrong. A deep, primal instinct kicked in, urging me to turn and run. But I stayed rooted to the spot. I stumbled upon the first trap. It was twisted, mangled, something had torn it apart with terrifying strength. A scattering of fur and dark, viscous stains on the leaves told me the trap had caught something. But whatever it was, it had escaped. A sense of dread gnawed at me, and I turned toward camp, my footsteps quickening. The sun sank lower, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor. Each shadow felt like a threat, waiting for me to let my guard down. "Joseph? Daniel?" I called, my voice echoing back to me, hollow and alone. That's when I heard it, a low, vibrating hum, like a distant growl, but wrong. Wrong in a way that defied the natural order. The sound seemed to vibrate through the trees, growing louder, drawing closer. My heart raced as I froze, my body trembling with fear. Then through the shifting shadows, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, broad, hulking. But as it moved into the fading light, my stomach churned. The thing was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long, and its posture twisted in a way no humans could be. Its skin seemed to shift, patchy with fur and scales that didn't belong together, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. A grotesque, monstrous thing that should not exist. I raised my bow, but my hands were shaking so violently I could barely notch an arrow. The creature tilted its head, watching me with a predatory stillness. I felt its gaze on me, cold, piercing, unyielding, but I refused to meet it. Without warning, it lunged. I fired the arrow instinctively, but it barely flinched as the shaft struck its shoulder. In the blink of an eye, the creature was upon me, moving with impossible speed. The force of its strike sent me crashing to the ground, its claws raking through my jacket and into my flesh. Pain exploded in my arm, but adrenaline surged through me, pushing me to fight. I kicked, throwing the creature off balance long enough to scramble away. It screeched, an ear-piercing, high-pitched wail that made my eardrums ring with agony. "Ethan, get down!" Joseph's voice rang out. I hit the dirt just as a shotgun blast cracked through the air. The creature staggered, blood pouring from its side, but didn't retreat. Instead, it snarled, a deep, resonating growl that shook the very air around us. It turned its focus to Joseph, charging at him with terrifying speed. Joseph fired again, the shot hitting it square in the chest. The creature was thrown back, but it didn't fall. It scrambled to its feet, unrelenting. Daniel charged in with his hatchet, swinging with all his might. The blade bit into the creature's arm, nearly severing it, but the thing was relentless, its uninjured arm striking Daniel and sending him sprawling. I couldn't let it reach Joseph. Gripping my knife, I rushed forward, stabbing at the base of its neck with every ounce of strength I had. The creature recoiled, flailing wildly, black fluid spraying from the wound like oil. It screeched again, thrashing in its death throes. Joseph didn't hesitate. He aimed for its head, pulling the trigger one final time. The creature collapsed in a heap, its grotesque form crumpling to the ground. We stood there, panting, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. The forest seemed to exhale, its silence suffocating. The creature lay motionless, its body sprawled across the blood-soaked earth. Daniel groaned, sitting up with a pale face. A gash ran along his temple, but he was alive. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Joseph's face was grim as he shook his head. "Something that shouldn't exist." We didn't linger. We bundled the creature's body in tarps and hauled it back to camp, its weight unnerving even in death. Daniel muttered prayers as he worked, his hands trembling. When we reached the cabin, night had fully fallen. Joseph called his grandfather, an elder versed in ancient stories, and when the man saw the creature, his face darkened. "It's a Nalia," he said, his voice low, "a shapeshifter bound to ancient curses. It was thought to be nearly extinct, but not impossible to encounter, if disturbed." He insisted on a ritual burning, warning us to keep quiet about what had happened. "Some things are better left buried," he said. We watched in silence as the flames consumed the creature's twisted form. The fire burned well into the night, until all that remained was ash and charred remnants. When it was over, Joseph clapped me on the shoulder. "Glad you came back, Ethan. Maybe not the reunion we expected, but you handled yourself." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. The next morning, as we packed to leave, Daniel found something in the ashes, a fragment of the creature's twisted jawbone. Joseph didn't say a word, but pocketed the piece with a look I'll never forget. Back in Kansas City, I tried to return to normal, but sometimes in the dead of night, I'd hear that strange hum again in my dreams. Or maybe it was real. Maybe the Nalia wasn't done with me yet. The memory of its cold, predatory eyes follows me, a grim reminder of how close I came to becoming its prey. It started with a hiss, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't a snake's sibilance or the hiss of a busted radiator. No, this sound felt alive, deliberate, like it was directed at me. I was parked deep in the Monongahela National Forest, nestled within a grove of towering pines, the RV tucked between their thick trunks. The air was icy for early spring, the kind of cold that crawls under your skin, and the trees whispered to each other in the wind, secrets no human should ever hear. My name is Eli Kenner, and this happened to me in 1987 when I was 34, seeking solace after a messy divorce. My RV had become my sanctuary, my escape. As a mechanic, I had the luxury of taking weeks off, disappearing into the wilderness far from the noise of courtrooms and lawyers. Here, there was no judgment, no guilt, just me and the oppressive silence. That night, however, the silence became suffocating. The sun had set hours ago, and the sky was a void, a vast expanse of ink black with no stars, no moon. I had parked near a creek, thinking the gentle rush of water would lull me to sleep, but instead, every sound felt amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and then that hiss, a sharp, insistent sound that seemed to curl around my ears like smoke. I stood frozen by the window, my hand trembling above the curtain, my heart pounding in my chest. The Remington 870 sat on the counter, loaded with slugs meant for any black bear or coyote foolish enough to approach. But this was not a bear. This was something else, something worse. The hiss came again, closer this time, and my heart seemed to stop in my chest. I grabbed the shotgun, racking it, my breath coming in shallow gasps, then yanked the curtain aside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it found nothing, only trees, shadows, the empty blackness beyond. Yet the sound, that sound, was real. I could feel it crawling under my skin like someone's breath at the back of my neck. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice cracking as it broke the stillness. Nothing. Then a low scraping noise like claws dragging along the side of the RV. I spun, flashlight darting across the aluminum siding. My hands shook violently, heart racing as the beam of light bounced erratically. Nothing. I swallowed hard, forcing my shaking hands to lock the door. "It's just the wind," I told myself. Or an animal. I sat at the dinette, the shotgun resting across my lap. Sleep was a distant dream. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching out like hours. Maybe I nodded off for a second, but the next thing I knew, the RV rocked violently, throwing me to the floor. The shotgun slid out of my reach as the RV tipped again, this time hard enough to rattle the plates in the cabinets. It felt like a freight train had slammed into the side of the RV. I froze, listening, terror clenching my chest, and then that hiss again, longer this time, twisting into a horrific screech. My blood ran cold as I heard it, a wet, heavy breathing coming from the other side of the RV door. I wasn't alone. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I moved on instinct, slamming the shotgun into my shoulder, aiming at the door. Whatever was out there, it had weight. I could feel it, the ground trembling as it shifted, dragging itself toward me. The door handle rattled. "Back off!" I yelled, my voice a desperate shriek. The jiggling stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sound. Then, with a sickening screech of metal, the door was torn clean off its hinges. I fell backward, the shotgun firing into the ceiling as the door crashed to the ground outside. I barely had time to register the figure standing there, hunched, massive, its silhouette outlined by the flashlight still on the counter. It was 7 feet tall, its body gaunt twisted like a starving wolf walking on 2 legs. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was a sickly, mottled pale, patches of raw pink flesh exposed like wounds that wouldn't heal. But it was its head that made my stomach turn. Too wide, misshapen. Its mouth, it stretched impossibly far, a yawning maw that seemed to pulse with every breath. It stepped into the RV, the floor creaking beneath its weight. I scrambled, desperate to reach the shotgun, but it had slipped too far. The creature cocked its head, studying me with those dark, unblinking eyes. its jaw working like it was chewing on something invisible. In a panic, I grabbed the frying pan from the sink and threw it. It hit the creature's shoulder with a dull thud. It barely flinched. But the distraction was enough. I launched myself for the shotgun, snatching it up just as the creature lunged. The blast was deafening in the cramped space. The slug hit it square in the chest and it screeched, a sound so horrible it almost made my ears bleed. It staggered back, clutching at its torso, but it didn't fall. Instead, blood, or something like blood, splattered across the walls, dark and thick. It charged at me again, faster this time, its claws slashing through the air. I fired twice more, one shot hitting it in the shoulder, the other in the neck. Its claws raked across my arm, the pain searing like acid burning through my flesh. The thing thrashed on the floor, its limbs jerking violently, but it didn't stop. Not yet. I backed toward the door, what was left of it, and stumbled outside. The cold night air barely registered on my skin. My only thought was to get to the truck, the one I towed behind the RV. I could hear it behind me, dragging itself along, its claws scraping the earth like nails on a chalkboard. I reached the truck, threw the door open, and fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life just as the creature slammed into the side of the truck. Its claw punched through the metal like it was paper. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires spinning on the loose gravel, but they caught, and the truck lurched forward, dragging the thing with it. For a few yards, it clung to the truck, but it finally let go, tumbling into the ditch with an agonized screech. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest ranger station, 20 miles away. My arm was bleeding badly, the gashes stinging like fire. The ranger on duty, a man named Carl, took one look at me and immediately called for backup. When I explained what happened, he gave me a long, skeptical look. But when we returned to the campsite, his face drained of color. The RV was destroyed. The walls were shredded, clawed to ribbons. The creature's body, now crumpled in the dirt, was a grotesque mess of shotgun wounds. Carl radioed for more help, and when the other rangers arrived, they didn't say much. They covered the thing with a tarp and loaded it into a truck. One of them, an older man, muttered something under his breath about things better left alone. They patched me up and sent me on my way. No explanations, no questions. Just a silent warning to stay far from the deep woods. I don't go camping anymore. Not ever.